I'm a librarian at Washington County, and we are very pleased to present Chuck Logan this evening, an author from Stillwater. I just have to say that the program is funded through legacy funds, and the legacy funds are distributed through MELSA, a Metropolitan Library Alliance. So welcome, Chuck. We're very glad to have you.
Maybe you should hold the applause until the end of things. Okay. So we have a camera on. I brought visual aids, and I brought a script. So I'm going to run through some talking points. If you don't, I'm going to read something. Is that okay with you? It's fairly clean. I think it'll be all right. It's not perfect, but the first thing is that I didn't want to call this book Fallen Angel, because Fallen Angel was the call sign for a downed helicopter in Iraq. And I was a field radio guy in Vietnam, and I thought it was a pretty lame call sign, because do you really want a bunch of kids on the radio net thinking of their crashed, wounded, and dead buddies as rebellious, wicked angels the Lord has cast out of heaven, which is sort of the root definition of fallen angel. Mayday worked just fine for us in the old days. This book has received attention as a medical thriller because some of the scenes take place in various VA hospitals where illicit drugs and misdiagnosis are used as a plan to silence and discredit the heroine. And so I would like to read an excerpt to give you a feeling for this. It's a little bit long, but I really like it, so you're going to have to bear with me. Late on a Sunday night, Jessie trudges behind her walker down the poly-trauma ward corridor. She has been granted some leeway to exercise because the violent freakouts have receded. She avoids sleep whenever possible because the wormhole terrors lie in wait in her dreams. Dragging herself from bed was not a conscious decision. Pure muscle memory forced her to plant her hands on the tubular strut of the forepod. She doesn't really understand that her muscles are the only part of her that still reliably work. Ka-thump. She scoots the walker forward, then pulls up her good left leg. Then she drags the stiff, injured right knee and gingerly tests her weight. The pain diffuses through the seroquel. Beneath this antipsychotic straitjacket, an unknown invader still lurks in her fatty tissues, and occasionally, when her liver burns some lipids for energy, residues of the PCP release into her sluggish blood, and it's freak-out time again. But that hasn't happened for more than a week, so she walkers the hall. She doesn't want to go clunk up and down the ward, but she isn't driving. Her body feels an imperative to practice walking erect, and it's her metabolism that orders her liver and kidneys to keep scrubbing away in an effort to restore the chemical balance in her brain. Ka-thump. She starts her crab scuttle turn at the end of the hall. An orderly trails her, makes a quick assessment, and decides to let her pursue her solo walkathon. Ka-thump. Shuffle, shuffle. Attracted by a surge in sound and flashing light, she veers to the side and approaches a crowd of patients and staff who assemble by a wall-mounted TV. One guy, like her, leans on a walker. He wears a patch over an empty eye socket, and a concave scoop is missing from the left side of his skull. A double and a quadruple amputee crane forward in their wheelchairs. Now more nurses and orderlies surge down the hall to join the increasingly animated group. Voices rise in a crescendo, and she feels a sensation like sudden rain pelt her face. She peers up at the television and can't separate out the sounds, not sure which parts originate with people next to her and which parts emanate from the flat screen. This tall guy in a dark suit and a red tie stands at the podium. There's more red behind him, a carpet, and on the left there's a cascade of red and white stripes. He's a black guy with close-cropped hair who looks vaguely familiar, and slowly she realizes it's the guy she works for. And now the people all around her are cheering. The ones who have hands pump them in the air. A patient standing beside her spontaneously turns and gives her a hug. Yesterday she would have reacted violently to another's touch, but something has changed in the space of her walk down the hall, and now she enjoys the feel of his encircling arms. She wishes he'd do it again. She blinks and concentrates on the screen where letters crawl along the bottom. The B she gets right off, but the I and the N escape her. Okay, next group. That's an L, and the next one is an A. Then there's a D. She misses that one along with the E and another N. The next group hits her eyes like a handful of rocks. D, E, A, dead. The general excitement swirling around her resonates inside the passages of her skull. Her ears and eyes pop. The muscles of her neck and jaw throb and strum. Giddy, she teeters, pitching off her feet, and immediately hands are there on either side to lift her and steady her. She does not shrink from the contact. Her central organizing principle, fear, is still present, but now it has company. She senses something confusing, some factor of ranging, that after the newness wears off, she perceives as depth perception. Slowly, she rediscovers how it works. Her skin is a boundary, and the people in the TV are on the outside, and the snare drum beating in her chest is on the inside. The suffocating, encompassing world is flamed out. No crawly stars, no choking on dirt. She staggers and steals her grip on the walker and experiences a manageable fear of falling that is followed by a buoyant distribution of her weight. Balance. Ha! She forces a hoarse, jubilant croak through her dry vocal cords. Then an image, not a sensation, causes her to start trembling and pouring sweat. It's an old wooden shed with uneven, weather-beaten boards and jutting, rusty nails. Gotta be early spring because the rutted ground is turning mushy and catches pools of snow melt. An 8-year-old girl braces herself to enter the low doorway. Spiders in there, other critters, coons maybe even an early snake. A gruff male voice, not unkind. Go on, girl, get in there. Bring out that old hose. Do it now, get. In there is full of cobwebs and rusty saws and crowbars, bars and pitchforks hanging on the walls, and piles of rakes and shovels that are shriven by lingering frost. And way in the back, in the dark, there's an old garden hose which is hopelessly tangled and still stiff and frozen. And she's got to go in there and grab it and drag it out into the light. This fat leopard spider scurries from behind a roll of barbed wire, and she stomps it flat with her muddy tennis shoe. And then she has to take the dirty, knotted, impossible hose in both of her bare hands and yank. She blinks and finds herself back in the present, not real sure where the picture in her head went or where it came from, or at first who the little girl was. And then she realizes that the girl was her, and she's just experienced a memory. So I'm back, slowly the notion forms, in my body. The memory prompts a fresh idea. Got to untangle the dead freaking worms. A flicker of hallucination follows on the thought like errant lightning. When it rears up, she stamps her good foot. Get back, squish your ass, ha! The effort drenches her gown with sweat, and the loose hospital pajamas cling, damp, to her legs, and her knuckles that grip the walker blanch white. It takes a full minute to accept that the runaway drum in her chest is connected to her rapidly expanding and contracting lungs. Air, breath, heart. Walk, they command. Laboriously, she sidesteps, braced on her forearms, and turns the walker. Doubling back now, she makes for the nurse's station. One last clunk, and the walker bangs against the desk. She grits her teeth, and the pressure in her cheeks threatens to bust the stitches in her jaw. What's she up to? The nurse behind the desk asks the orderly, who shadows Jessie. I'm on it, he says, hovering. He'd noticed her accept the hug from another patient in front of the TV, and has accompanied her step by step on the way back. Looks to me like Captain Craig is trying to smile. When her breath backs off to a manageable pant, she steadies herself with her left hand and reaches out with her right and tries to grasp a ballpoint pen that lies on a stack of printouts on the desk. Easy there, Captain, the orderly gently guides her hand away from the pen. That's a no-no in your case. Ha! Making eye contact with the orderly, she more slowly, deliberately extends her fingers toward the pen. The orderly raises an eyebrow and exchanges glances with the nurse. What the hell? He stays his hand and watches closely to see what she'll do next. Slowly, awkwardly, she touches the pen, then curls her fingers around the slim cylinder. In a clumsy movement, she experiments with mapping shapes on the paper. What happens looks like a game of hangman the cat got. Deep furrows crease her stitched forehead, and again she grits her teeth. Now several more of the staff have torn themselves away from the president's announcement and gather around the desk. Jessie takes a deep breath and looks past her nonsense scribbled in the block of type on the sheet. For several long minutes she studies the thicket of black Caslon characters. The concentration prompts another crooked flash from the new time machine in her head, and she sees a cloud of ravens rising over the stubble of a winter wheat field. Her palm is damp with sweat and smudges the page, blurring the type, as she positions the pen and bears down, drawing the tip in an erratic loop around the letter B. Rest, exhale, blink sweat. Then she forces her hand further across the type and makes another scraggly circle around the letter T. Shaking with exertion, she trundles her palsied hand to one last letter. Almost cross-eyed with exertion, she manages to capture an R. B-T-R, the orderly pronounces. Again, Jessie grits her teeth and strains her cheeks as she hugs the pen protectively to her chest in her fist. B-T-R, the orderly repeats. Jessie attempts a vigorous nod that comes off in slow motion, but she manages to raise the hand with the pen and points an index finger to her head. B-T-R, better, get it? The nurse says in a hushed voice. The orderly drops his jaw and exclaims, well, no shit, girl, no shit. The second celebration that erupts at the desk is tempered by Jessie's refusal to give up the pen. When the orderly patiently attempts to extract it from her hand, she clutches it possessively, and a defensive snarl comes to her lips. He has to pry it away digit by digit. That's when they all look around and see the doctor watching with a frown on his tired face. What the hell's Craig doing with a pen? She tried to stab Christine Morel with a pen, for Christ's sake. They try to explain. Okay, great, but no pens. Get her back to speech therapy in the morning. Flashcards good. Pens not good. So some of the book takes place in hospitals. Okay. In 2013, I had published 8 novels with HarperCollins, a big New York publisher, and I had a top-notch New York agent. But several years back, I found myself at a crossroads. The blues singers always tell you, you meet the devil at the crossroads. My editor at HarperCollins thought I should write something more serious. My agent thought I should write something more commercial. Okay. The shorthand on that dichotomy is easy. Commercial sells, serious or literary doesn't. Another way of thinking about the difference between commercial and serious is that successful commercial fiction provides an escape hatch through which the reader can escape reality. Serious fiction can take an opposite tact and can start peeling back the layers of our everyday life. This is not an impossible dilemma for a writer. My books have been criticized as getting lost somewhere between commercial and literary. If you can find readers on both sides of the divide, you can turn into what's called an upmarket author. So I decided to opt for an aspect of what's really happening in our everyday lives. The angle I chose is that a fraction of 1% of our population was on open-ended deployments to 2 wars, and the rest of us were going to the mall. Furthermore, when we go to the mall, we frequently find books and movies that glorify a whole bunch of stylized violence that we never intend to get our own hands dirty with ever. Case in point, the movie The Hurt Locker. I was on the point of walking out of this movie, and my wife reminded me we paid to see the movie, and we should see it through. Okay. The Hurt Locker was a huge success and won Academy Awards. Almost universally, combat veterans rolled their eyes at the scenarios portrayed, the personality, the dynamics, the tactics, the missing chain of command, the radio comms, and even the uniforms that were unrealistic to the point of surreal. It reminded me of a moment in a factory in Detroit in late 1967. I was getting set to go into the Army. And this older guy, who had fought in World War II, gave me some parting advice. He said, "You know, kid, it ain't like in the movies." Watching all the attention The Hurt Locker received, you could get the impression we no longer understand war ain't like in the movies. Maybe it's like a cable channel out there that we don't have to watch. So I decided to write a thriller that touches just a little bit on what happens to the minds and bodies of the kids after they get banged up in the action movie. So Fallen Angel went through a couple of drafts, all of which were rejected. Things didn't look good. The agent finally told me to forget about it, just put it aside and move on. Like a lot of mid-list writers, I was dead in the market. Maybe he could find me work as a ghostwriter, he said. In the business, this is called the death spiral of the mid-list writer. But it wasn't my first death spiral. But in the past, when I got pushed out the door at 1,800 feet, I was wearing a parachute. This time I wasn't. So there I was, about to take the leap, and this skyhook floats by. And I grab it. Millennium Pictures had reoptioned my novel Homefront and had greenlighted a major motion picture. Okay, so now what? HarperCollins is my friend again and publishes a tie-in edition. One of my visual aids. I start working on 2 novels related to my Broker series, thinking I can get a boost out of the movie. I continue work on Fallen Angel, which I intend to publish as an ebook. So what happens? Nobody reads the tie-in edition. Nobody is interested in the books I'm working on. And I discover that ebook publishing is a buyer beware world where most people are only interested in selling you services. Most of my books have been very well reviewed. I mean, you know, you can be a critically acclaimed unknown writer, apparently. But nobody explained to me in the midst of all this something I really should have known, but it was always handled by people in mid-Manhattan. Reviewers read ARCs, advanced reader copies. You know, it says not for sale proof. Okay. A reviewer, whether it's the trade reviews like Publishers Weekly or book reviewers, want to see the book before anyone else does. So if people are eager to help you publish an ebook, you've already cut your throat there, you know. So when you wind up out in the cold, you got to learn to live in the cold. It's Minnesota, right? So I started over at the beginning with, you know, I signed on with a small independent press and finally printed this copy, and that's what we're here to, you know, we'll talk about tonight. And so as I've described this process, there was a steep learning curve on getting this done, and it's sort of a casualty of relocating from traditional to indie publishing. Now for the fun stuff. Here's my visual aid. You know, we can talk about what happens when your novel turns into a movie. First of all, this was the original novel, Homefront. It's the only cover HarperCollins ever did that I liked and I fought for. It's supposed to be suggestive of a woman going through depression. Okay? No woman here. The main character in my book is not in the movie. The movie takes place in Louisiana because it has a 30% tax credit for movie companies, not in northern Minnesota. And my shaggy, you know, character, Phil Broker, turns into a bald-headed Brick, Jason Statham, who is a real nice guy, as a matter of fact. And so what I like to say is, imagine the transporter bay on the USS Enterprise, okay? And your story reports to be beamed into the Hollywood galaxy. Okay, it arrives minus a lot of the parts and people and with way more gunfire and expletives than were ever in the original. But the chances of your book being made into a real movie are about 100,000 to 1. So you got to take a realistic approach. It's like selling your car, right? Once you sign the paper and take the money, it's their car. You got to get over it. And there's a story I like to tell, which may be apocryphal. There was a very popular book in the 50s called The Young Lions. I don't know if you're familiar with it, written by Irwin Shaw, who was a World War II vet. Marlon Brando bought the movie rights to The Young Lions. And in the original book, there's this happy-go-lucky Austrian ski instructor who gets caught up in the Second World War and slowly turns into this brutal Nazi. Well, Brando rewrote the story and turned this guy into this gentle German. And so they were filming the movie, and Irwin Shaw, who got off a landing craft at Utah Beach and walked to the Rhine, walked up to Brando on the set and knocked him cold. Now, he shouldn't have done that because he took the money, right? Any rate, so that's my little script. And so I'm hoping we can get a lot of questions out of you folks.
The imagery was just amazing, but how did you get in there?
Oh, I've been in some hospitals.
Did you do a lot of research with?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I did a lot of research. Originally, this book, when you talk about a reality-based story, I mean, when I started writing this book, the reality I was being influenced by was I couldn't believe what was going on in the war in Iraq. I was just going crazy. The whole thing was just, I was amazed, you know. And so originally, I went on a political rant. And originally, this book started with Osama bin Laden's face in a sniper scope in 2001 at Tora Bora on the Pakistani border in Afghanistan. And some of the characters who later showed up in this book were special forces guys. They were being told, no, don't do it, come back, too close, or something like that. And the shorthand on it was, look, you can't kill the devil at the beginning of the crusade because it'll be bad for the invasion of Iraq. And a lot of people are going to make a lot of money in Iraq. And so a lot of the thinking that went into that is that, oh, we have this war, which is this financial instrument that is a jobs program for contractors. And I went on in that vein, you know, and I was, talking about, part of the scenario dealt with $9 billion in missing development funds that nobody talks about anymore. $9 billion, you know. And the people in New York just said, no, this is, you know. and I finally, at the heart of the story, I wanted to have a strong female character, but I wanted to make her real folks. And I have to ask this question: is there anybody here from Langdon, North Dakota? It's just, you laugh, but when I did a book called After the Rain, that I decided I set in North Dakota. I wanted to be up by the Canadian border. And so I just got a map out, and I picked a town, okay? And then I got the local sheriff to call the county sheriff there and introduce me. So then I drove to Langdon, North Dakota, which is a little town that I didn't even think it had a flashing red light. Certainly it didn't have a stoplight, about maybe 1,300 people, something like that. So before I go to the cop shop, I decide to drive around, see the town. So I pull up to the park, and there's the slide and the swings and the merry-go-round in a perfectly restored 57-foot or whatever Spartan missile. I said, oh, this is interesting. I didn't research Langdon, North Dakota. So I go and I meet the local sheriff and deputies, and I discover that Langdon, North Dakota is the exact dead center of the North American continent, and that's why that's why they put the original ICBM belt there. And they talk about the missile time in Langdon the way the Lakota talk about the buffalo, because the town had 2 stoplights, it had 4,000 people, it had tons of, it had 500 kids in the school, and it was like, and I just wandered into this world that I didn't know about. I went back to Langdon for a book sign. I have a key at home. This is the key to Langdon, North Dakota. and over the years, you'd be surprised how many people from that little town show up at book signings. You know what I mean? And there were things that happened there that you just can't make up. That's one of the fun things about researching books. And it's kind of eerie because, and the cops take you up to the border. And this was years ago. This was 8 years ago. I'm sure there's more of a presence than there was then, but there are dozens of roads through the week going into Canada because they've been smuggling stuff on that border for 100 years. Some of the roads are graded, you know what I mean? And the family farms have all been picked off, and so nobody really lives up there. If you see some lights off in the distance, it might be your neighbor buying fertilizer in Canada. You're not going to say anything. It was just fascinating. But in the old, this state cop told me this story about an actual launch facility. The individual missiles are spaced out. And it's kind of eerie because they have pens, great big pens with numbers on them. It's like you can almost imagine something's caged in there. And that's so the Russian satellites can verify there's nothing going on there. But I think it was something like 10 birds are connected to a launch facility, and a launch facility is similar to what you see in the movies where the guys go down in the ground into a bunker, And it had a small, number of people manning the place. And one night the AP or the Air Force MP was walking around the perimeter, and he flips a cigarette and goes to bed. Well, in the morning they smell smoke, and then they discover they built this launch facility in a peat field, and it starts burning, and then it starts burning the cables that connect the missiles, and lights start flashing off and on. And Russian satellite imagery starting to pick up signals, and a lot of mail-ox is being consumed in the Pentagon. And they couldn't put it out. They had to take the missiles offline. And it finally burned out on its own. Now, I couldn't invent that story. This is hearsay, but that's one of the stories they told me. The heroine in the story she's not some action toy badass. She's a smart, competent farm kid who wants to learn to fly, and so she joins I invented a National Guard unit, and she'll do her bit to get the training, and she just flies into something she's not supposed to see and becomes a target. And I won't tell you anymore because hopefully you read the book. You know what I mean? What did I do before? I'm from Detroit, where I spent high school outside of Detroit, and I tried to go to. But the point is, I left Detroit in '69 when I got out of the Army. I was on my way to Missoula, Montana. I'd taken a test in Vietnam or signed up to take a test at the smoke jumper school. I thought that would be an interesting thing to do. But I had a buddy who was in South Minneapolis, a Detroit buddy, who was going to the U of M. So I thought I'd stop by and see Larry. And I got to his house, and I'd always worked nights I flunked out of college. The last English class I took, I think, was in high school as a senior. I think I got a C-. I'll get back to that more. But anyway, so I always worked nights in the factories in Detroit after I flunked out of college. I'd never seen Star Trek, ever. Never seen Star Trek. And this was in December 1969, and Channel 4 was showing Star Trek 5 nights a week. I thought, cool, you know. Then I discovered that, you know, that socialism had prevailed because as a veteran, I could get a year's unemployment in Minnesota, which protected my booze supply. You know, and so I sort of didn't leave the basement for 3 or 4 months. And that's why I never went to Missoula, Montana, and didn't die in a lodgepole pine someplace. And that's how I got to the Twin Cities. And at some point in there, I sobered up. But I had been in kind of an underground cartoonist, you know what I mean? And I had done the front of a journalism review for somebody that worked at Pioneer Press. And they called me up and said, the Pioneer Press is looking for a staff artist. So I go in there, into this office, and I've got this portfolio of just outrageous underground cartoons. And there's these 3 guys sitting there, you know, 3 Irish gentlemen with red noses, O'Grady, Burnham, and Finnegan. All 3 of them World War II combat vets. Now, my name's Logan. This is not an Irish face. No way. My dad, I never knew my dad, but he was a prize fighter and manager and some other stuff in Chicago. That's why my mom left him when I was an infant. And so something happened, and this was like 1974, that never happens ever now, I don't think. These guys gave me a break. I was totally unqualified for the job. Totally unqualified for the job. You know, I think the executive editor said, can you handle an airbrush? Yes, sir. I went back to the art department a little while later, and do you know who Jerry Fearing is? Okay, I was replacing Jerry Fearing. He was going to become a full-time cartoonist, you know, and I was going to become a staff artist. So I walked up to Jerry Fearing and I said, "What's an airbrush and how's it work?" Okay, so I had this job that I never expected I'd get, but I was still getting in trouble. And I finally figured out that if I quit drinking, I could date reporters and copy editors and photographers instead of barflies on the West Bay. And so I had this incentive to keep this job. So several years down the line, Marianne Grossman, the book editor, handed me this book. It was a lousy book, but the point is she said, "Why don't you write a book review?" I said, okay. So I wrote a book review. And then 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 reporters came up and they said, "Chuck, who wrote that book review for you?" And I thought, this is a signal. And so I got into trouble with the management, and they told me I wasn't going to draw anymore. And so I started experimenting with writing. And a couple of people helped me, mainly the woman that became the executive editor, Deborah Howell, who was killed in a freak accident in New Zealand 2 years ago. And I started plugging away, and she allowed me to go half-time to concentrate on writing. And so what did I know? So I write this giant novel about the summer of '67 in Detroit. And I got stuck for a while in the middle of that riot. You know, I thought this would be an interesting thing to write about. And I tried to find an agent, a local guy, and he sent it to some people. And they said, this is like licking the bottom of a dirty ashtray. You know, all this factory stuff and racial stuff. And, you know, nobody wants to read about this. You know, this was years before L.A. went up in flames and Rodney. Okay, you know, it's like this huge thing. I pushed it under the bed. So then I thought, well, you know, I read too much Norman Mailer growing up. And I wound up in the Army and going overseas. So I thought I'd write a war novel, except I was an advisor to the Vietnamese. So I was in the Vietnamese Army. So I wrote a Vietnamese story, kind of. Big, you know, and I'll get to that again in a minute. And they said, this is incomprehensible to an American audience. And I said, well, maybe that's why we had some trouble over this. It's like, and ironically, you know, like when, if you're in the traditional publishing world and you're living out here in the flyover zone, you wait for the phone to ring. So they'll tell you what your life is going to be like. And so the last conversation I have with this guy in New York is, you know, it's all over. And instead of getting depressed, I went over and I opened this file cabinet in my office, and I took out this manuscript that's about 700 pages. It's so old, or it's 20 years old. I don't even have the discs it was typed on. It's so old that the pages are hand lettered. And it's so old that there was only one copy of it, you know, like up until the previous 6-7 months. And I thought, well, I found it in a dusty box in the garage. I said, maybe I should take it to Office Max and get a copy just in case. And I took it out, and I'd been told, by, an editor actually told me this. He said, Chuck, in America, in American publishing, there's an F word, there's an N word, and there's a V word. Nobody wants to hear about this stuff. No one's going to read this. You know what I mean? Okay, so I thought, okay, I reread this thing, and it's got training wheels on it. It's interesting to see how your mind works 20 years ago. But I thought, there's a really good story here if you cut out 200-300 pages. And I thought, now that I'm with this small independent press, I can publish this book. And they're not going to tell me I can't. And I actually was excited by that. You know what I mean? And the books that one of my reactions to all this wait a minute, let's go back to the movie stuff. The movie stuff was fun, because are any of you familiar with Stonebridge Elementary? Okay, remember the old monkey bars, the cool monkey bars, not the sissy monkey bars they have now. They had cool monkey bars years ago. And when my daughter was 8 or 9, the kids would really work out on the monkey bars. And that's where I started thinking up this Homefront novel, kids playing on a playground. Okay, so all this stuff happens, they're going to make a movie. What does that mean? You don't know what that means, and you're really outside the loop, and no one's talking to you, and no one was more surprised than the people in New York that this whole option came back and it actually happened. And so suddenly the trailers start appearing, and the first trailer starts out with this kid swinging on monkey bars. Oh, that's cool, And then my daughter had a bunny, which was in the story, and a little black cat. And so then there's a picture of the little girl in the story in bed with her bunny and her little black, you know what I mean? And that part of it was really fun. And the people were cool. The people were cool. And it was fun to go to a premiere, and my daughter got to get her picture taken with the bunny, with the little girl, the girl that played the daughter in the story. But and like I said, I was at peace with the fact that everything would just change massively. I was surprised that no one was interested. I guess the people that watch action movies, and this was maybe a couple cuts above your average action movie, because they kept some of the backstory. No, I haven't got back into rewriting that yet.
Okay.
Because one of the first things I did, when this started, when I realized they were making a movie, I thought, well, I'm going to come up with more books about these characters. And the first idea I had, my kid spent 2 summers at this international scholarship leadership camp in upstate New York with kids from all over the world. And I thought, there's a kid in the story, and so I thought, why not write a book about the kid's a teenager and going to a camp like this, and her folks are all retired, cranky, broken down, whatever action figures, and they're on vacation. It would be in Vietnam because I want to go back to Vietnam to research again. And they disappear. Everybody gives up on them. They're lost. They're whatever. But there's a Vietnamese camper at the camp. And the interesting thing about this camp, Camp Rising Sun, it's been around since before the Second World War. It has this very prestigious and very deep alumni list. Like former assistant secretaries of defense, Pete Seeger, the police chief that was killed in Mumbai in 2008, a terrorist attack, alumni of Camp Rising Sun, tons of diplomats all over the world. And so there's an infrastructure, a network these kids could use to solve international stuff. I was excited about writing this, and then some 22-year-old Bryn Mawr graduate said, we can't decide if this is an adult novel or a young adult novel. And I said, well, what was True Grit? I mean, was it an adult novel? And so, and what I did start, what I'm working on now is, you know, if you have a continuing character, these guys get kind of old after a while. So I thought I'll do a prequel novel about how young Phil Broker got into what he does, and set it in 1979, before all this stuff was going on, you know what I mean? And it was like, that'll be fun trying to, you know, reset, you know, take a reset day and figure out how to write about. But I sort of think people default to when they were young. I mean, when I hear music in my head, it's music from back then, you know. And so that's sort of kind of this, there's like 3 books have parts started, and then I have a really, really bizarre, absurd idea that goes back to my political cartooning days. You know, and I was a little bit twisted then, you know. And like I try to explain to my daughter, I said, you know, if you come from like in a box from IKEA, you come with operating instructions. You know, how do you assemble this personality and stuff? And I look back on my personality back there. Then in my office, I have this cartoon that was an invitation to my 30th birthday party, which incidentally was held on the night they caught the Watergate burglars. You know, I'm an old guy. I was born a week after the Battle of Midway. And it's this sort of haunted-looking Jesus Christ carrying this big picket sign that says, "Don't trust anybody over 30 who hasn't been crucified." You know, and so those are my operating instructions. And I'll preface this with saying that you know what Hollywood pitch language is? And it's become it took over publishing too. In other words, you got 5 seconds to sell, you know, the high concept. You know, what's a high concept thing? You know, Jaws, that's high concept, you know. So I thought, okay, what if you had this drunken Vietnam vet who's far gone in this total wet brain alcoholism, and he's living in this cabin up on Crane Lake where I deer hunt on the Canadian border, and he finally gets to the point where he decides to commit suicide, but the way he's going to do it is he's going to stop drinking and go into alcohol shock and die. He throws all his booze and his car keys into the lake, you know, sits down and waits to die, and he goes into the delirium tremens and has these incredible, empowering fantasies, and then suddenly realizes that there must be a reason that the people who raised him put booze in his formula, because when the alcohol leaves his system for the first time in his life, he turns into a left-wing werewolf. See, that's an effective pitch line. If you can get people to laugh like that. And I think I'm going to, you know, write that and have fun with that, you know, because, you know, people get rich creating right-wing comics and novels, so I do the other side of it, you know. After the rain, it bummed a lot of people out because it had a kind of a local terrorist scenario dealing with nuclear power plants, you know. And people just, you know, like a guy actually wrote me an email, or I was forwarded an email from, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, where the reviewer said, "This is a really good book, but I just can't bear to deal with it," you know. After that book came out, you might get a kick out of this, I was in Red Wing, I think with Homefront, you know, in a group about this size, a little larger, and this guy in the back of the room kept breaking in and asking me questions about After the Rain. And he was, you know, the whole thing was, you know, he said, "You couldn't do that, what you said you did in that novel." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, you couldn't, you know, blow up, you know, you couldn't do that to that nuclear power plant." And finally I said, he said, "You couldn't do it now." And I said, "Could I have done it back when I wrote the book?" And he said, "Let's talk." So we wind up sitting on the curb for 3 hours, you know, back when I still smoked cigarettes and whatever, and or cigars. And he was one of the engineers who designed Prairie Island. And he said, you know, I said, "This book was really a bomb." He says, "Yeah, but it was widely read throughout the Nuclear Regulatory Agency." And they put $80 million into fortifying Prairie Island. You know, and I thought, okay, I suppose that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I feel good about that, but it didn't do anything for my bottom line. And so those are interesting little vignettes about that. But, you know, there's a question of how much reality you put into a novel. You know what I mean? Like, if we're living here, and it's shortly after a major terrorist attack on the United States, what am I worried about? I'm worried about the closest thing that can cause a lot of damage, and I wish everyone else would too, you know. So I wrote about it. It turned people off, you know. So I started moving toward female protagonists, you know. I mean, I'm a gender traitor. I've always liked women more than men. I don't, just back to life. And when I wrote my first book, you know, I sort of cobbled together this thriller. And after it came out, Hunter's Moon, it's kind of this twisted, semi-autobiographical, dark, messy book. Okay, but anyway, this New York editor, he says, you know, Chuck, he said, all the men in this, all your characters are chain-smoking, recovering alcoholic Vietnam combat vets. And I said, well, who do you know? And he said, well, we don't know anybody like that here, and so you got to come up with something different. And this was back in the 90s. And one of the things I was thinking about, I decided, well, I'll have a female character. Because what struck me, for instance, during the first Gulf War, my wife is a photographer for the Pioneer Press, right? But there was a slot in a combat pool to cover the war for the Night River Corporation. And so the picture editor asked 3 or 4 guys and her to go. And all the guys say no, and so she's going to go. There's this really neat photographer on the staff, this black guy named Joe Oden. And the picture editor doesn't want to ask him because he doesn't like to talk to Joe because, I don't know, Joe gets in his face. Whatever the reason. And I go to the picture editor, you know, and I say, Joe was a combat photographer for the 173rd Airborne in Vietnam. I said, oh, no, Jeannie would do better. And I say, Jeannie doesn't know the little stuff they wear on their arm and stuff, you know, and she'll stand up at the wrong time. And I said, I'm going to be doing dishes, watching CNN, you know, looking for my girlfriend in the desert, you know. And that's where I slowly got the idea that you could have this broker character whose wife was this hard-ass soldier, you know, with a chip on her shoulder, and he's stuck, you know, changing diapers and fixing the screen door. And that upset a lot of people, too. You can't have a thriller hero who's domesticated. Maybe this is a case where I erred on the side of being a better fiction writer and not being relentless, because the reason I created this character broker as an undercover cop is I took a serious look at police procedure, and I said, I don't want to write realistically about all that stuff. I want somebody who cuts corners. You know what I mean? But I suppose if I had to go back and address something like that, what I'd say, I don't want to ruin the story for people that read it, but the point was he wasn't trying to get this woman addicted to Valium, you know what I mean? He's trying to kill her, for Christ's sake, you know what I mean? And you know, he disappears, he's a spook. Who cares what the record says, you know what I mean? But you're right. I did a lot of research for that, but I probably didn't do as much as I should have. But see, sometimes you can get so deep into research that you lose the thread of the story. You really have to be careful, you know. If you get too realistic, people will go, you know what I mean? I mean, I'm just trying to get the overall idea, you know, that you could. And it was an ex-VA psychiatrist who gave me the idea. If you want somebody to present as psychotic, you overdose them on PCP, you know. And they're going to have all the kind of word salad, garbled stuff that's going to present like TBI or a whole lot of stuff. You know, and so as a fiction writer, then you have license, you have range to play with stuff, you know. And because real life is usually, come on, the whole thing is about, we all think the bad shit's going to happen to the other guy, right? That's the whole theory our life is based on. Not me, the other guy. And then what I do is say, what happens to you and how do you get out of this? You know what I mean?
Well, I think we better thank you very much for coming. It was fantastic. Books for sale, if anyone would like. Program evaluations, if anyone can.